I have a feeling that it was not easy for the disciples following Jesus around Galilee. Just saying. Here he is walking along the lovely shore with his lovely disciples, and out of the blue, Jesus goes like, "The Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of the powerful, and they will put him to death, and 3 days later will rise again." Total buzzkill, Jesus. These guys don't have any idea what Jesus is talking about, and they are afraid to ask him. Because the last time Jesus had said some words like this, Peter began arguing with him, and Jesus called Peter Satan, and it was a pretty ugly scene. So it's no wonder that the 12 disciples were more than a bit afraid to say something inappropriate to Jesus. So they naturally decided to say inappropriate things among themselves. That's right. Arguing heatedly about which one of them was the greatest and who would get to sit at the right hand of the Messiah. Can you imagine how that discussion went? Yo, Peter, when Jesus sets up his kingdom and kicks the Romans out, I'm going to be like so totally his right-hand man. No, John, you're a total loser. I'm like JC's homie. No me, says Matthew, no me. It must have been an embarrassing scene to witness. So they came home to their quiet place in the fishing village of Capernaum. And the disciples sit down, a bit perturbed, perhaps, by the sound of children screeching outside. And Jesus sits down with them and asks quite innocently, "So, what were you guys arguing about on the way?" And they didn't look at him. And they looked down on the ground, at their knees and the dirt floor, somehow knowing that they had done something really, really wrong. And Jesus, a bit perturbed perhaps by the behavior of the disciples, only days after the ugly incident with Peter, may have been at a loss of what words to use with these dense disciples, how to explain to them when they are so slow to learn and quick to forget. So I imagine that there may have been a cry from outside their dark, safe house that broke his concentration. I imagine that maybe Jesus went out through the open door into the dusty street where he could hear more clearly the noise of playing children. And I imagine he brought one in. Perhaps a little girl with wide open dark eyes and a wild mop of pitch black hair and dirty little hands and feet. Perhaps Jesus hugged the little girl to reassure her and set her down in the middle of the disciples. And then he said, "Anyone who takes in a child like this and considers her as important as oneself is taking in me. And whoever takes in me is taking in the one who sent me."
That, I think they understood. Though, really, it does lead to even more questions. Because we all get that it's important to welcome children, but it's not simple. Any of you who has had any part in a child's life knows that. Even if you're a childless cat or dog person, you would know that.
Just saying.
Just saying. Right? Our friend Steve Garnis-Holmes wrote a piece that says something like, if a stranger came to us and used up all our money and took up all our time and ruined our house and then sat amongst the tatters and said, "Will you love me?" we would likely say, "Why would I do that?" Right? But when it's a newborn, when it's a child, of course, of course. Sorry, those of you who are new parents, you know already, right? Mostly in a good way. When we have children, when we adopt a child, when we are friends with people who have children, when we become part of the life of a godchild or a niece or a nephew or a neighbor's child, when we start to serve on the school board or we get involved in a social organization that is interested in making justice happen for children, any of the myriad ways that we might put children at the forefront of our lives, they're amazing and they're wonderful and they're complicated and they tend to take us in directions that we did not expect and ask things of us that we did not expect to give. And yet we commit. We commit because of love. We commit because we who are Jesus' people are committed to be servants, even when being servants can be complex. And Jesus taught his disciples then and teaches us now, it is the one who is the most vulnerable, it is the one who is most needy and most dependent that we are to serve. So he came across the writings of a retired pastor or priest from the Anglican Church of Canada who makes this distinction that I think is helpful today. He says, it seems to me there are two kinds of vulnerability. There's what I might call given vulnerability. A human baby is vulnerable. That's a given. Folks who are homeless, mentally ill street people can be very vulnerable. Young women and girls are very vulnerable, particularly in some societies. People with advanced dementia are vulnerable. The examples are endless. The realities that cause given vulnerability, it's a given. That kind of vulnerability does imply weakness and demands protection and caring and resources, changes to society for that kind of given vulnerability. And then Mr. Purdy says, Reverend Purdy says, there's another kind of vulnerability that is not given, but is chosen. I can choose to be vulnerable, to lay myself open to misunderstanding and criticism, to ridicule, to rejection. But it is often a choice that leads to more communication, a deeper intimacy and personal growth. And then he says, chosen vulnerability is not a weakness. In fact, it requires much interpersonal strength. It's risky. It can fail. It is exactly what it says it is, a personal choice to let down defenses and make oneself vulnerable. You have to know who you are and have a strong inner sense of self for chosen vulnerability.
So when Jesus speaks to his disciples about the last being first and the most powerful being the servant of all, and the treatment of a child as a gauge of true Christian discipleship, he's speaking about chosen vulnerability. Yes, it's risky if we're doing it right. And it's where we always find Jesus.
So how do we do chosen vulnerability? We who live in a part of the world that is so much about being first, not even second, much less last, right? How do we choose vulnerability? Here's an example from 2015, from the wedding of a groom and bride, Fethullah and Ezra, in Turkey. Like weddings in the United States, Turkish weddings are big affairs, lavish affairs. They're all about the couple and celebrating their union. There's lots of food and lots of dancing. It's a huge, expensive project. In 2015, this Turkish couple decided that they would take the money that would have gone to their lavish marriage and use it instead to provide dinner to 4,000 refugees from Syria who were sheltering in Turkey at the time.
The idea actually came from the groom's father, who's an active member of Kimse Yok Mu, which was a Turkish charity that helps thousands of refugees. He mentioned it to his son and future daughter-in-law, and they thought, why not? So on their wedding day, the bride in her wedding gown and tiara, and you can Google this, you can find the pictures online. The bride in her wedding gown and tiara and the groom in his white tuxedo went down to the food distribution center where they were giving out the food that they had bought and handed out cooked food to 4,000 Syrian refugees. And the story of the gift was picked up by news agencies all over the world.
So I got curious and I looked up Kimse Yok Mu online because I wanted to know what it meant. And it turns out it's Turkish for, is anybody there? Is anybody there? Which is exactly what Jesus is asking of his disciples, it seems to me. It's exactly what Jesus is asking of any of us who would be disciples. Is anybody there? Is anybody there who is trying to get what it is I'm about? Jesus asks. Is anybody there who welcomes this child? Is anybody there who welcomes me?
It's what James was asking too in today's epistle reading. Is there anybody there who is peaceable and gentle? Is there anybody there who is full of mercy and good fruits without hypocrisy?
Is there anybody there who chooses vulnerability the way God has chosen vulnerability to be with us? Because when we are here, when we serve, we find ourselves immediately in God's presence and doing part of God's work in the world, healing what is broken, loving what is unloved, companioning the brokenhearted, forgiving those who need forgiving. Kim si mok yu. Is anybody there?
I reimagine the scene back in that quiet room in Capernaum, surrounded by his silent and watching disciples. How perhaps Jesus gave the little girl one last squeeze, how she squirmed and giggled, and then how that powerless little one who pulled rank with grimy fingers and a runny nose skipped out from the dark room for the bright sun to play in the dusty Middle Eastern street. Amen.
Amen.